December 17, 1944, Hansfeld, Belgium. Colonel Joachim Peiper, commander of the Waffen-SS armored vanguard, watches his Tiger immobilized by the freezing dawn. Around it, silent engines. Not by sabotage, nor by ambush, but because the tanks were empty. 24 hours earlier, the German High Command was still smiling at the boldness of its latest offensive. They believed that the Americans would retreat. They believed that it would be enough to cross the Ardennes to cut the Allies in half. They believed that fuel would come later. This belief, like many others cultivated by the Third Reich, would be destroyed not by an explosion but by a spreadsheet. By capturing an American warehouse with 50,000 gallons of gasoline, Peiper thought he had won the lottery. But the papers abandoned by the Americans would reveal something that even their enemies did not say out loud. Those 50,000 gallons were insignificant. The war was not being fought between divisions but between productive systems. And in this field, Germany was already defeated. This video will show how the discovery of a fuel depot turned a tactical victory into a strategic sentence. Because when gallons are worth more than men, whoever controls the oil controls the destiny. But before we dive into the logistical details, there is one statistic that single-handedly carries the weight of this whole story. By December 1944, as one of the Waffen-SS's most feared colonels celebrated the capture of 50,000 gallons of American gasoline, the United States was consuming more than 7.5 million gallons a day on the European front, and getting even more. What seemed like a miracle to the Germans was to the Americans just a pause in the flow. A single forward depot, hastily abandoned, contained more fuel than an entire panzer division would receive in a month. But Peiper didn't know that. Not yet. If you value fact-based stories, deep research, and storytelling that goes beyond the obvious, consider supporting this work. Leave your like, subscribe, and help keep alive the memory of the details that changed the course of the war. In 1944, Germany still saw itself as a modern military power, but it was waging mechanized warfare with 19th-century infrastructures. German synthetic fuel refineries, such as Leuna and Pölitz, were being systematically bombed by Allied aviation. Production, which in April was still around 175,000 tons per month, fell to less than 5,000 in September. It was the collapse of an energy promise based on coal and ideological optimism. The trucks of the panzer divisions were now supplied with adulterated mixtures. Trains shared coal with the civilian population. In many regions of rural Germany, tractors had been replaced by horses. On the front, the shortage forced absurd decisions to divide the fuel between advance and retreat. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the United States was refining 1.8 billion barrels of oil per year. The East Texas oil field alone produced more than all of German-occupied Europe. And the American machine didn't just extract, she distributed. The war was powered by engines but won by tubes. In June of that same year, Operation Pluto went into operation, laying oil pipelines under the English Channel, directly connecting England to Normandy. In a matter of weeks, the Americans were pumping 1 million gallons a day to the European continent. At the same time, on the roads of France and Belgium, the Red Ball Express operated 24 hours a day with up to 6,000 trucks simultaneously. Each of them consumed on average 40 gallons a day, enough to make any German attempt to replicate the model unfeasible. The Allied force wasn't just armored, it was supplied with a regularity that Germany could never achieve. And yet, in the Berghof bunker, Hitler and his generals talked about moving entire armies to Antwerp, with fuel obtained in the field. They bet on capturing deposits as if they were inevitable, but the data didn't lie. While Germany counted liters, the Americans poured millions. In concrete figures, German oil production, including synthetic refineries and Romanian fields, did not exceed 33 million barrels per year. The United States produced more than 50 times that. The Luftwaffe, no longer reserved, cut the training of its pilots, from 250 hours to 60. The German Navy began equipping submarines with snorkels in an attempt to save diesel. The field hospitals operated with generators turned off. Meanwhile, the Americans installed gasoline-powered washers in camps and disposed of contaminated fuel in ditches. The discrepancy wasn't just quantitative, it was existential. What the Germans called a strategic resource, the Americans treated as operational routine. One of the statistics most ignored by the German High Command was between the lines of logistics reports. In December 1944, The daily consumption of American forces in Europe was 7.5 million gallons. Every 3 hours, the United States burned the equivalent of the entire warehouse captured by Piper and Hansfeld. If this data surprised you, comment below. Logistics wins. Because in the end, this was the real invisible weapon. American industry was so stable that it allowed it to make mistakes, waste, retreat, and still win. The lost gallons did not stop the machine. The gallons won, for the Germans were too rare a prize to be used freely. It is within this contrast that the German logistical collapse needs to be understood. It was not just a lack of fuel, it was the absence of a system. A system that the United States built with redundancy, interconnectedness, and long-term vision. Each truck route was connected to a railroad, which led to a port, which was supplied by a pipeline, which drew from a field on home soil. It was a closed, predictable, and incessant chain. Germany, on the contrary, depended on looting, captures, margins that did not exist. And even in the face of this, the Third Reich continued to believe in the strategy of speed, the idea of a logistical blitz, where the enemy would feed the advance. But the Americans had already foreseen this risk. Each great Belgian cross kept a deposit, and each depot was ready to be destroyed at the slightest threat of capture. Too much fuel? Burn. Abundance allows unthinkable choices for those who live in scarcity. And what the Germans did not yet know is that the maps found in Hansfeld would reveal the size of the miscalculation, because that captured deposit was just one of dozens. And the next discovery, at Stavelo, would show not only the excess, but the conscious decision of the Americans to deny fuel to the enemy at any cost, including the cost of burning millions. Because for those who have millions to spare, burning is a tactic, not a tragedy. And for those who have only thousands, to see it burn is to witness the end of the war before the last shot. The next part of this story begins with fire, and a simple command: destroy everything. The plan for the last major German offensive on the Western Front did not begin with tanks, maps, or artillery. It began with an arithmetic illusion. In October 1944, Hitler gathered his high command to introduce Operation Wacht am Rhein, a daring maneuver to cross the Ardennes, break through the Allied line, and capture the port of Antwerp. The goal: to divide American and British forces and force a peace negotiation in the West. But the very skeleton of the operation was already born under terminal logistical risk. General Alfred Jodl and Marshal Walter Model knew there was not enough fuel even for the full offensive, let alone sustain an occupation in depth. Still, Hitler insisted. The proposal was clearly stated. The success of the operation would depend on the capture of American stocks along the way. There was no supply plan. There was a bet, a kind of military roulette in which the enemy would carry Germany's empty tank to the end of the line. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, took the figures directly to the Führer. He warned that Allied bombing raids had reduced German synthetic fuel production to less than 10% of capacity. Refineries such as Pulitz, Leuna, and Böhlen operated intermittently, constantly hit by British B-17s and Mosquitoes. By September, production had dropped to 5,000 tons, not enough to keep a modern army moving for more than a few days. Speer recommended calling off any large-scale offensive operations. It was ignored. Hitler was convinced that the moral superiority, tactics, and audacity of his forces were still sufficient. And more than that, he trusted that the enemy would not have the courage to destroy his own resources. But American courage would present itself in another form, that of burning what others would die to obtain. Operational calculations for Joachim Peiper's battle group, designated as the spearhead of the offensive, estimated the need for 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. Hitler officially allocated 5 million gallons for the entire operation. Enough, in theory. In practice, total deliveries amounted to less than half. Broken trucks, destroyed bridges, airstrikes, and confusion in the command of transports meant that only a fraction of what was promised reached the troops. For Peiper himself, 31,000 gallons were delivered, enough for 50 miles of operations in difficult terrain. The distance to the Meuse River, the first major objective, was 65 miles. In other words, the mathematics of failure was already incorporated into the plan before the first shot. There would be no going back, just moving forward, or collapse. The commanders on the ground knew this. In meetings held days before the offensive in Tondorf, General Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, was blunt with his officers. You will have fuel only if you take it from the Americans. No further delivery will be guaranteed. Move forward, capture, and continue, or stop. In light of this, Piper issued strict orders. The tanks would march in single columns to save consumption. The engines should be turned off at every stop for more than 5 minutes. No firing, no tactical maneuver, no strategic move would justify the use of fuel unless a depot was conquered. The war would now be measured in gallons per mile. The offensive itself began late. The artillery barrage that opened the operation on 16th of December used more ammunition in 2 hours than some entire German campaigns at the start of the war. But, in the first few hours, the reality of the road proved hostile. German maps based on obsolete civilian data indicated routes as paved roads. In the countryside, dirt and mud trails were revealed, unable to support the weight of the panzer columns. The tanks designed for the open fields of Russia bogged down in the forests of the Ardennes. In the first 24 hours, vehicles were held up by traffic jams in their own units, and with the engines running for an excessive time, fuel was consumed at idle, an invisible wear and tear that never entered the optimistic calculations of the command. The strategy of looting was beginning to show its cracks. For a war machine that was already operating at its limit, every logistical mistake became a sentence. The Luftwaffe could not secure continuous air cover. German supply trains were under constant attack from the resistance and aviation. And meanwhile, American convoys advanced along mathematically coded routes, moving 20,000 tons of supplies a day, including 3,000 tons of fuel. On December 16th, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion, stationed less than 30 miles from Piper's starting line, wrote in his diary, "Complete refueling. Tanks at the limit of capacity. Third delivery this week." The contrast between a desperate offensive and an operational routine reveals an uncomfortable truth. While the Germans risked everything for a chance to refuel, the Americans refueled 3 times a week and still complained about delays. Hitler's plan, therefore, was more than flawed. It was blind, and his generals knew. In 1952, Colonel Friedrich von Mellenthin, then head of logistical operations for Army Group B, wrote in his memoirs, "All the officers knew that there was not enough fuel, but the order was clear: execute. The hope was to capture, but secretly everyone knew if the first deposit wasn't there, the operation would be over before it started." And the first depot, in Hansfeld, was there. But what Piper would find inside him was not just fuel. It was the omen of a reality that would dismantle the logic of the Third Reich. Because when the tank fills up and the defeat continues, the problem was never the engine. It was the world around him. And the next part begins with the arrival in Hansfeld and the sound of a gallon opening, December 16th, 1944. Even before dawn, the Ardennes forest was shaken by a dry roar of artillery. Over 2 hours, the 6th SS Panzer Army dropped more than 1,000 tons of ammunition on the American positions. It was the beginning of the so-called Ardennes Offensive, a last hope maneuver dressed in the grandeur of the past. But under the smoke of the first shots, the smell of logistical exhaustion was already born. At 07, the Kampfgruppe Piper began its march. Ahead, Tiger and Panther tanks with detailed and strict orders: maintain constant speed, avoid sudden acceleration, turn off the engines at any stop for more than 5 minutes. The advance would be in a single column, not by tactical strategy, but by rationing. German engineering, once a symbol of offensive precision, now operated under principles of domestic economics. Every liter was counted, each curve calculated. On paper, the plan called for the 31,000 gallons allocated to Piper to allow for 50 miles of advancement. But on rough terrain, with detours, stops, and cross-traffic, this distance dropped significantly, and the first obstacles appeared within minutes. Maps provided by German General Staff Intelligence showed paved roads where dirt tracks existed. Some were not even viable routes for armored vehicles. Entire columns had to go backwards, redraw itineraries, consume fuel at idle. Progress, measured in kilometers per hour, quickly turned into miles per liter. At Lanzerath, a village on the immediate path of the vanguard, 18 American soldiers from the reconnaissance platoon of the 99th Infantry Division held position for more than 10 hours. With light weapons, improvised trenches, and a single Browning machine gun, they managed to delay hundreds of German armor and vehicles. While Piper's men waited for the road to be unblocked, their tanks burned precious jerry cans sitting in the cold. The octane-demanding and fuel-efficient Maybach engines consumed up to 2.5 gallons per mile in combat. Without combat, at idle speed and uneven terrain, consumption increased. In just 24 hours, the combat group had advanced about 20 miles and had already used up more than 40% of its total fuel reserve. A mediocre tactical performance, but a catastrophic logistical collapse, and the worst was yet to come. Meanwhile, American forces, even under attack, operated fluidly. The Red Ball Express kept running, with 2.5-ton trucks transporting fuel, rations, and ammunition from depots in Normandy and the French countryside. On December 16th, alone, 1 million gallons of gasoline were delivered to troops on the European front. It was almost 40 times more than all the fuel Piper had for his offensive. What for the Germans was a 1-month salvation plan, for the Americans was just the next day. On the field, this asymmetry soon turned into visual contrast. German tanks advancing with extreme caution, while American columns refueled their Shermans with normalcy, still not fully understanding the scale of the enemy attack. There was no panic. There was supply, and constant supply. At several points on the front, American units reported having already received their third load of fuel that week. The Germans, on the other hand, had received the first and last. Reports from Wehrmacht radio operators in this period show a growing unrest in communications. Units requesting tanker trucks that did not exist, trying to calculate the remaining range based on inaccurate measurements. The radio, which was supposed to coordinate the offensive, became a channel of despair. Meanwhile, Captain Rose of the American 743rd Armored Unit wrote in his diary, "We received more fuel today, full tanks. We are waiting for instructions." The irony of the contrast could not be more brutal. A division waiting for orders, fully supplied. Another trying to move with the tank in the red. German engineers, aware of the situation, began to improvise. Some lighter vehicles were towed to save fuel. Trucks with a mixture of vegetable oil were used in emergencies. But no adaptation solved the central problem. The offensive depended on speed, and speed burned gallons. When engines devour their own resources faster than the supply line can replenish, collapse is not a possibility. It is an inevitability by appointment, and that time was already approaching. Late on December 17th, after 2 nights without resupply, Piper's column reached the vicinity of Hansfeld. There, the Americans had hastily abandoned a fuel depot. Bonfires were still burning. Mugs of coffee lay untouched on drums of oil, and stacked like pyramids were the jerry cans. What seemed like a miraculous vision presented itself before German eyes as a sign of redemption. 50,000 gallons. More than Piper had begun the offensive. More than many panzer divisions received in a month. But what the colonel didn't know, yet, was that this discovery was not a gift. It was a reflex. A reflection of what he would never have, and a document forgotten on the floor of that warehouse would show, in a few lines, that what he captured as a victory, Americans considered it surplus. The next part begins with the reading of these papers, and with the absolute silence that follows. The narrow road wound through the dark, silent trees of Hansfeld as the first armored vehicles of the Kampfgruppe Piper caught sight of the metallic silhouettes gleaming under the light snow. They were drums. Stacked in orderly rows, hundreds of gallons of gasoline lined up like a promise. The place, clearly abandoned in a hurry, still exuded human warmth. Portable stoves smoked between the tents. Mugs of coffee, now cold, rested on empty ammunition boxes. Some clothes still hung on improvised drying ropes. For soldiers who had slept on the ice and rationed fuel drop by drop, that sight bordered on the mystical. Piper dismounted from his vehicle and walked slowly to the drums, each one with the unmistakable marking, 100 octane, U.S. Army. The sergeant soon ordered the redeployment. Engines were restarted. Officers drew up quick calculations. If everything there were usable, they could advance to Trois Ponts, perhaps more. But then, when they turned over the makeshift command post, they found a box of documents left behind. Inside, cargo manifests, consumption reports, and supply orders. And it was there that the illusion began to crumble. In one of the papers, dated just 3 weeks earlier, a logistical report detailed the path of that fuel. Refined in Texas, transported by rail to New Jersey, shipped to Southampton, then transferred by pipeline to Normandy, trucked to Reims, and finally unloaded in Hansfeld, all in less than 28 days. The roll was technical, cold, but for the German officers who read it, the message was devastating. What they treated as a miracle of war was, for the enemy, just another step in an automated and continuous chain. One of the radio operators, Franz Schaffer, would later write, "We thought we had won. Then we saw that it was just what the Americans discarded when they were in a hurry. The deposit was not a prize. It was a vestige, a surplus. The fuel Piper found hadn't been left as a trap. It had been left because American wartime was worth more than the contents of the jerry cans." Every minute spent defending that post would cost more than the 50,000 gallons stored there. This is the irony that runs through the entire narrative. While Germany risked entire divisions for one shipment, the U.S. could abandon dozens without changing the pace of its offensive. The war of the Germans was made of urgency and necessity, that of the Americans, of flow and calculation, and this was even more evident when comparing scales. For the U.S., those 50,000 gallons accounted for 0.006% of daily fuel consumption on the European front. For Piper, it was the survival of the operation. The discrepancy between tactical value and strategic value had never been clearer. The discovery of the papers caused silence. There was no celebration. There was understanding. Captain Rudolf Warzenek, in charge of the immediate distribution of the fuel, reported to his men, "Go ahead with this, but know that the enemy overcomes us not with soldiers, but with columns that do not cease." The American machine worked with systemic precision. Behind each gallon was a logistical engine. Behind each drum, a policy of redundancy. When one point failed, 3 others made up for it. Germany, on the other hand, operated with zero margin. Every loss was irreplaceable. Every mistake is fatal. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them, but on the wrong side of the war. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more detailed content like this. Piper's march would continue, now with full tanks and quiet morale. But what they would see at Stavelo just hours later would not be another victory. It would be the final confirmation that they were fighting an enemy who could afford to burn what the Germans could never conquer. And there, in the face of flames and smoke, there would be no more doubts. The early morning after Hansfeld's capture, Colonel Joachim Piper remained awake, studying American documents found among the fuel drums. The flames of the makeshift fireplace cast shadows on the walls of the ransacked house where he had set up his command post. The Allied supply maps, the logistical manifests, the regimental distribution spreadsheets, all pointed to a gear that went far beyond the battlefield. That wasn't just gasoline. It was the tip of a system that began at protected refineries in Texas, crossed oceans under naval escort, and landed with surgical punctuality at the most advanced points of the front. There was no improvisation. There was no faith in the unforeseen. There was planning, and it was uninterrupted. Piper, a veteran of the Eastern Front, was not naive. He knew that the Americans were numerous, well-equipped, noisy, but until then he believed, like so many others, that they lacked fiber, discipline, stoicism. The myth of the moral and technical superiority of the German soldier still circulated strongly among Waffen-SS officers. Now, sitting in front of a piece of paper with Fort Worth logistical stamps and fuel delivery dates less than 30 days from the front line, he began to realize they were fighting something that couldn't be bravely won. It was a gallon war, and the gallons were all on the other side. Some soldiers from his unit, around the same table, were silently leafing through reports. One of them, Lieutenant Hans Kerner, whispered, "They have too much fuel." Another replied, "Or we are the ones who have too much war." The effect of the discovery was not immediate. There was no panic, but there was something more dangerous for an army on the move: doubt. The doubt was not about the mission, but about the logic that sustained the mission. Until then, they believed that the offensive in the Ardennes would be the turning point, the maneuver that would re-establish the strategic initiative, that would show the Allies that Germany still had strength. But the idea that the entire operation depended on capturing posts like that, and that these posts were just leftovers, began to erode the core of conviction among officers. The perception was uncomfortable. The enemy was so supplied that he could abandon supplies to speed up the retreat, and they, the armored elite of the Reich, advanced begging for drums. From then on, the fight was no longer just against the Americans. It became an internal confrontation between what they had been taught and what they saw before their eyes. Nazi doctrine preached that willpower overcame material limitations, that the Germanic spirit, aligned with order and sacrifice, compensated for any numerical disparity. But no spirit would push a Panther out of fuel. No order would extend the range of a Maybach engine beyond its physical limits, and no sacrifice would beat the replacement time of an Allied convoy running 24 hours a day. What Piper saw now was that war had changed its nature, and perhaps it had always been that way. It was not a dispute between generals but between systems, and the American system operated with redundancy. For every gallon burned, 2 were on the way. For every loss, 3 alternatives. The German system, on the other hand, operated on the margins of bankruptcy. Each gallon captured needed to be defended as a position. Every loss was irreversible. The result was inevitable, even if it was still invisible on the map. And in that instant, Piper understood something his superiors would never admit. They were fighting not against soldiers, but against a civilization in an industrial state of war. The difference wasn't just one of production, it was one of design. What the Germans called a genius improvisation, the Americans called a failure of planning. What was a critical resource for the Wehrmacht was surplus for the U.S. Army. The logic was reversed, and with it, confidence. Lieutenant Kerner, observing the march the following morning, commented, "We are supplied, but we don't know until when." They know. It was the beginning of an internal collapse, not yet tactical, but already psychological, because confidence, once unshakable, now looked over his shoulder. The enemy, once underestimated, now seemed omnipresent, and not because of their infantry, but because of their convoys. And the road ahead promised no relief. It promised fire, because the next deposit, Stavelo's, would no longer be found intact. He was waiting for them in flames, and with it, the certainty that the war was being lost without a battle. Burning fuel was, for the Americans, just another step in defense. For the Germans, it was the collapse being executed before their eyes. 2 days after Hansfeld, Piper's columns approached Stavelo, a small town cut by tracks and surrounded by tactical depots of the American Army. The terrain, now swampy and uneven, forced the armored vehicles to march slowly, consuming more than they could spare. German radios had been picking up signs of unrest in the sector for hours. Explosions, smoke on the horizon, and intercepted reports of U.S. Army engineers carrying out logistical containment measures. When the first detachment of the Waffen-SS crossed the bridge south of the city, the image was of an apocalyptic scenario. Gallons, drums, and trucks were on fire. The temperature around the fuel piles made the snow melt in perfect circles. Black smoke rose to the skies like columns of silent defeat. Estimates made by German engineers would later reveal that more than 2 million gallons of aviation gasoline and vehicle fuel were deliberately destroyed at Stavelo. The American order was clear: deny every drop to the enemy, whatever the cost. Colonel Piper, already on edge, didn't say a word when he saw the flames consuming what could have been his lifeline. He just turned and ordered the advance to the next position, as if he already knew that nothing could be saved from there. The American logic was brutal but infallible. Fuel can be replaced. Time and position cannot. For the United States, which refined more than 4 million barrels a day in 1944, incinerating 2 million gallons was not even an operational setback. It was part of the planning, a calculated redundancy. For the Germans, every liter burned was a blow to the heart of the offensive. In less than a week, between depots at Hansfeld, Stavelo, Trois Ponts, and Malmedy, more than 8 million gallons of fuel were deliberately destroyed by American forces. This amounted to almost 4 months of total consumption of the German armored force on the Western Front. What the Germans sought with extreme sacrifice, the Americans eliminated as a caution, and the distance between these two positions was not just material, it was ideological. The intentional destruction of resources on an industrial scale was, for Wehrmacht soldiers, an inconceivable concept. In previous campaigns, tanks were left behind for lack of fuel. Officers were ordered to carry out missions with minimal supplies. The fuel for the German army was sacred. But there, in front of the smoldering ruins of Stavelo, a new doctrine was understood. American victory came not from unerring precision, but from the ability to absorb mistakes and continue to operate as if nothing had happened. Burning 8 million gallons and moving forward was more than power. It was freedom, logistical freedom, operational freedom, freedom to make mistakes. In contrast, the Germans walked on a taut rope with no margin, no redundancy, no plan B. Lieutenant Hans Kerner wrote in his campaign notebook, "We thought the gods were with us, but now I see that they are on the side of those who can waste and still win." The morale of the troops, which was already suffering from the cold and growing resistance, began to deteriorate, not because of tactical defeats, they were still winning isolated combats, but because of the realization that they were fighting against a machine that could not be stopped, only avoided. With each deposit burned, a little of faith dissolved. The doctrine of German technical superiority, taught since the SS training, collapsed in the face of the brutality of the figures, and the numbers did not stop. While Piper tried to divert to find new sources of fuel, the Red Ball Express delivered another 3 million gallons to the southern and central sectors of the Allied front. A continuous line of trucks that operated non-stop, with driver rotation, color-coded routes, and field maintenance. The Americans didn't need to capture, just keep it, and the maintenance was total. That's the difference between an army and a system. The Germans were still fighting with the mentality of tactical maneuvering. Americans struggled with spreadsheets, and these spreadsheets were expiring. Behind the scenes, U.S. commanders made decisions based on distribution charts and risk maps. The loss of a deposit was immediately compensated by relocation. The high command knew that the enemy would come for fuel, and so decided to make it useless, burning on the field, but keeping the flow intact. This was the real strategic humiliation. What was death for some was routine for others. The war had now changed scale. It was no longer about divisions but about redundant systems against fragile systems, and the result of this was to reveal itself in its rawest form, because Piper's next move, trying to cross Trois Ponts, would show the limit of hope. A destroyed bridge, an empty depot, and, for the first time, tanks being abandoned for total lack of fuel, not defeated by bullets, but by calculation. On the third day of advance, Joachim Piper's column was approaching Trois Ponts. The tanks were still roaring, but now at spaced intervals, as if each engine already knew that the next turn might be the last. The pace had slowed down, not by enemy resistance but by internal containment. The remaining fuel rationed to each platoon was counted in cans and no longer in gallons. A Panther consumed 2.5 gallons per mile. The distance to the next supply point was 40 miles. The account didn't add up, and no one pretended it would anymore. When the scouts reached the Trois Ponts bridge, they found only smoke. The structure had been destroyed by American engineers a few hours earlier, in a coordinated operation with the clear objective to deny the German advance without even confronting its units. The alternative path was longer, narrower, and would consume even more fuel. Piper then made a decision that would haunt the memory of his men: to abandon vehicles without minimum autonomy. In one open field on the side of the road, 26 German armored vehicles were left, whole, intact, weighing tons of steel, without a drop to move them. No battle had been fought for them. No ambush had stopped them. They were defeated by the fuel tank stopwatch. Major Schnabel, who was in charge of the unit's logistics, looked at the maps with an icy expression. He whispered almost to himself, "They throw away what we risk lives to conquer." And he wasn't wrong. In the December 1944 campaign reports, it is said that the Americans disposed of, on their own, about 8 million gallons of fuel in less than a week, just to prevent use by the enemy. In the same period, the entire German armored force consumed about 700,000 gallons, a tiny fraction. The difference between abundance and scarcity was arithmetic, and devastating. For every liter of gasoline the Germans used with surgical precision, the Americans burned 12, deliberately. If this number surprised you, comment below with "Logistics wins," because this is the unspoken essence of modern warfare. It is not the tank that decides, but what feeds it. American superiority lay not only in its ability to produce tanks, planes, or ships, but in the fact that even if it missed, it was left over. An exploded bridge? It was recalculated. A lost deposit? He redirected himself. A derailed train? The next train was already moving. The power was not in precision but in repetition. Germany, on the other hand, operated like a crystal juggler. Every mistake was irreversible, every loss terminal, and this did not go unnoticed among the soldiers. In diaries recovered after the war, Waffen-SS fighters recorded the growing frustration. "We marched, we saved, we prayed for fuel. They light a fire with him." In another passage, a radio operator writes, "We are surrounded, not by men, but by their ability to make mistakes and to keep going. The defeat now was not tactical, it was existential, because German tanks, while technically superior in many respects, were being outclassed by a reality that could not be met with armor. It was the weight of logistics that crushed morale. It was the sound of the American speakers that, even under attack, did not cease. It was the roar of refueling engines that never slept, and every gallon burned, every drum abandoned in flames, was a silent declaration: we have more resources, more time, plus everything. Sergeant Weber, who was in charge of keeping the Tigers operational, wrote a pencil note in a maintenance notebook. I never thought we'd lose like this, with the tanks full and the road blocked by nothing but smoke. Smoke, in fact, became the new symbol of war. It was no longer the fire of battle, but the fire of discard. What was unattainable was incinerated, and the sight of this eroded the conviction of men trained to see the world in black and white, victory or death. Now they faced a third possibility: irrelevance. Because an army that depends on the conquest of surpluses inevitably fights late, the Ardennes offensive, which had begun with the hope of a turnaround, was now on foot. And the sound of the shut-off tanks became louder than any explosion. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Because among the documents recovered at Trois Ponts, there was a memorandum with the projection of delivery for January 1945. More than 12 million gallons of fuel for the northern sector of the front alone. It was the future, printed on paper, and for Piper, the future was a path without gallons. What German soldiers saw burning at Stavelot and abandoned at Trois Ponts was not excess. It was the end product of an unprecedented logistical architecture. Behind the scenes of the European front, the engine of American war pulsated with industrial precision. The gear began in the oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma, from where crude oil was extracted by refineries that operated in 3 shifts, under the protection of National Guard units. Refined into high-octane gasoline, it was sent by train to ports such as New York and Baltimore, where naval convoys organized by the anti-submarine escort system guaranteed its crossing to Great Britain. From there, some went by pipeline, but the bulk went down the English Channel, landing on the reconquered beaches of Normandy, and entered the tactical distribution system. This system had a name: Red Ball Express. Created shortly after D-Day, Red Ball was a dedicated network of 2 5-ton GMC trucks that operated unique routes marked with red balls, transporting supplies at an average of 12,000 tons per day. The vehicles operated in relays. While one driver rested, another took over. Maintenance was carried out at mobile repair stations, strategically positioned every 80 kilometers. Gasoline wasn't just transported, it was measured, routed, prioritized, based on rudimentary but efficient logistical algorithms. And the intelligence of this system went beyond movement. It was also standardization. All of the Red Ball trucks used interchangeable parts. Every bolt, every hose, every joint followed a unified code. A mechanical problem did not paralyze the mission. It just changed the truck. Standardization, rare in European doctrine at the time, allowed what the Germans never achieved: uninterrupted continuity. And behind the standardization was industrial conversion. Between 1942 and 1944, more than 450 American civilian factories were converted into military production units. Car manufacturers manufactured tanks. Refrigerator manufacturers assembled airplane engines. Cosmetics industries produced ammunition seals. The war was not an effort. It was a national operation. The Pluto, Pipelines Under the Ocean project, another milestone of this system, established underground pipelines connecting England to France shortly after landing. 2 main pipelines, Bambi and Dumbo, carried up to 4,000 barrels a day, reducing dependence on naval convoys and speeding up direct supplies to the front. The American machine didn't just move, it adapted, duplicated, and refueled on the go. What impressed the German soldiers was not just her abundance, it was the coolness with which she operated. There was no hurry. There was a procedure. And the procedure does not fail. It just repeats itself. Unlike the Wehrmacht's constant improvisation, which relied on the pinpoint genius of commanders, the U.S. Army relied on the mathematical regularity of systems. Bravery was important, but subordinate to structure, and this structure allowed for failures. Therein lay the real American advantage. While Germany needed everything to go right, the U.S. could fail again and again, and still win. A fallen bridge? There were parallel routes. A sunken ship? The next convoy would arrive in 3 days. A miscalculation? He corrected himself in the next delivery. That was the difference between operating at the edge and operating with redundancy. And redundancy was the language of victory. In an analysis made after the war, General Eisenhower stated that gasoline won the war. It was not just rhetoric, it was diagnostic. The Allied engines did not stop, neither day nor night, and while Germany counted tanks, the U.S. counted depots. While Germany calculated routes based on distance, the U.S. plotted them based on replenishment. This difference in logic was the real battlefield, a field where Germany has never stepped with an advantage. Colonel Piper, when questioned months later, said coolly, "What they had, it was an impersonal war, but an impersonal war that crushed us. The American war did not need to hate in order to win. I needed to calculate." And the next installment will show how far those calculations have led, to the point where even deliberate destruction became weaponry, and where American tanks were advancing, even though they didn't know they had won an invisible battle. From the moment the first gallons of American fuel touched French soil, an invisible but absolutely lethal network began to operate with superhuman efficiency. This network did not fire shots, it did not drop bombs, but it moved all the machines that did it. It stretched for hundreds of miles, linking ports, pipelines, storage centers, truck routes, and refueling stations like a logistical nervous system. The Cherbourg-Paris operation, for example, was just one of the axes of this silent architecture. Its main pipeline delivered up to 180,000 gallons of gasoline directly to divisions in the French countryside daily. Further east, the Seine-Reims line completed the mesh with a precision that would render any German plan obsolete. Fuel flowed underground, immune to weather, sabotage, and bombing. And when it didn't flow through pipes, it crossed roads and convoys protected by military intelligence and redundant routes. But the real genius was in the anticipation. Each sector of the front received logistical forecasts weeks in advance, based on models of consumption, terrain, weather, and enemy movement. If a division needed 90,000 gallons a week, it received 120,000. The margin was not a luxury, it was doctrine. The logic was brutal. It is better to remain than to stop. And surplus, unlike scarcity, allows for mistakes. Mistakes that the American army could make without going offensive. While Germany was doing the math at a survival pace, the U.S. operated a geometry of abundance. There was fuel where there were still no troops. There was gasoline waiting for battles that had not even begun. The storage centers scattered between Le Havre, Saint-Lô, Reims, and Metz together added up to a technical reserve of more than 100 million gallons of fuel, enough to move the entire Allied force for weeks without any additional replacement. And the most impressive, this entire structure was just one arm of the logistical effort. At the same time, sea convoys crossed the Atlantic with almost industrial regularity. An average tanker carried between 150,000 and 300,000 barrels of oil. Thousands of these crosses were made between 1943 and 1945. The average time between pumping crude oil in Texas and filling a Sherman tank in Normandy was less than 6 weeks. 6 weeks. An intercontinental war, fueled with the precision of a railroad schedule. And at the center of it all were men who didn't fire guns. Engineers, statistical, planners. American logistics intelligence predicted not only consumption, but error. It provided for sabotage, loss, misplacement, wear and tear. And he projected solutions even before the problems manifested themselves. Logistical officers such as General John C. H. Lee, commander of the lines of communications in Europe, operated with a business, not military mindset. For Lee, every leader delivered was the result of a process, not heroism. And it was this mentality that won the war, because war, at that time, was no longer a contest of courage. It was a dispute of flow, of calories per day, gallons per mile, from parts to engine. And this mathematics, the U.S. mastered as a science. The logistical spreadsheets that guided the supply of the European front looked like reports from transnational companies. Each distribution center operated with contingency protocols. Each route had an alternative plan. Each loss was immediately recorded and compensated. There was no improvisation. There was engineering. Unlike Germany, which operated under the weight of constant adaptation, The U.S. moved by calculated inertia. When a platoon advanced, it did not ask if there was fuel ahead. I knew there was. When a commander decided to prolong the operation, he did not consult luck. He consulted the stockpile. This systemic trust was, in itself, a weapon, because it gave soldiers operational freedom that the enemy did not have. And more, it generated a morality sustained not only by speeches, but by deliveries. The American soldier could be surrounded, tired, wounded, but he was never out of supplies. And that changed everything. Modern warfare does not belong to the bravest one, it belongs to the most constant. And the constancy of the United States at that stage of the war was almost superhuman. No German general could conceive of an operation where logistical errors were predicted 6 weeks in advance. No Wehrmacht officer could operate with a 30% margin of loss and still maintain the offensive. Because at its core, the war Piper and his men were fighting wasn't just against tanks or infantry. It was against a system designed to win by inertia. And that inertia was only accelerating. Because on the other side of the Atlantic, new pipelines were being activated. New refineries adapted exclusively for war came into operation. And a new generation of trucks, lighter, faster, easier to maintain, was beginning to replace the old models on supply routes. The war was not yet over. But the American machine was already operating as if it were only a matter of time. And while German soldiers looked at maps and searched for depots with faith, Americans looked at charts and knew exactly where every drop would be tomorrow, because the next piece of data that would be discovered by the Germans would not come from a tank. It would come from a radio, and it would bring confirmation that, even with its best units on the field, the Reich was being defeated by something that could not be destroyed with bullets. The winter offensive was advancing on maps and communiques, but behind the scenes, the German army was sinking into a sea of technical contradictions. What seemed on the surface to be a cohesive, mechanized force was in reality an unstable logistical mosaic. French vehicles captured during the fall of 1940, Italian trucks inherited from the North African campaign, Czech tractors repurposed as artillery platforms, Soviet tanks hastily adapted for German use, all coexisted in the Wehrmacht battalions, but nothing spoke to anything. Each engine required a different type of oil. Each refrigeration system required unique care. There were trucks that ran only on low-octane gasoline. There were tanks, such as the Tiger and Panther, that did not tolerate the synthetic fuel produced by Germany from coal. There were vehicles that broke down due to excess purity, others due to lack. Diversity was lethal. The chaos was invisible, but constant. German logistics, already stressed by Allied bombing and the loss of Romania's oil fields, now imploded from within, sabotaged by the very complexity of its fleet. There was no standardization. There was improvisation, and improvisation consumes more than it delivers. In some panzer divisions, mechanics operated like alchemists, mixing oils from different sources to keep engines running for another day. The Wehrmacht, which prided itself so much on its technical precision, was kept alive by patches. While the Americans filled entire columns with single gasoline, compatible with all engines, the Germans had to separate fuel by batch, by type, by origin. And this separation required time, resources, and personnel, 3 elements that the Ardennes offensive had completely consumed. A Panther, for example, needed more than 800 liters of high-octane gasoline for a single day of combat. But if it received captured American fuel, there was a risk of overheating or failure of the ignition system. Opel Blitz trucks, the backbone of German logistics, required lubricants that had not been produced on a large scale since 1943. Field officers reported that many units simply melted axles for lack of grease. Literally, in one of the reports intercepted by the American Intelligence Service, a captain of the 12th SS Division wrote, "We have fuel, but it is not suitable for engines. It's like offering wine to a diesel engine." The analogy was not exaggerated. In some cases, fuel captured from the Americans was dumped directly on the ground, as it was incompatible with German vehicles. It was the waste of victory, because the tactical success of capturing enemy resources was converted into operational failure due to the inability to use them. Germany was no longer fighting only against the Allies. He was fighting against his own fleet. The technical disorder was silent but corrosive. While American industry produced standardized engines in series, with interchangeable parts and universal maintenance, the Germans dealt with a mechanical zoo, and the more they advanced, the more the problem worsened. Broken vehicles needed to be towed by other vehicles, which in turn consumed additional fuel. Each improvised repair created a new vulnerability. At some points in the offensive, trucks were left behind not for lack of fuel, but for lack of the right key to open the engine compartment. High command officers were beginning to realize that the enemy was not just ahead, it was in the system itself. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, had already warned Hitler months earlier. We can no longer sustain a mechanized war with 20 types of engines and 50 of oils. The warning was ignored. The German doctrine of war of movement was based on flexibility, but its technical reality required standardization. And there, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, this contradiction became fatal. Meanwhile, the Americans received Sherman tanks by sea, with new engines ready to operate on any standard Allied fuel. The difference in approach was brutal. On the one hand, a machine that required constant adaptation. On the other, a machine designed to work under any condition, even with errors. And mistakes at that point in the war were no exception. They were the norm. Lieutenant Rudolf Hess, not to be confused with his Nuremberg namesake, wrote in his diary, "I now understand that war is not won by soldiers. It is won by grease." It was a bitter but true acknowledgement. German tanks did not lose to enemy fire. They lost to the inconsistency of their own guts. Amid the cold, the snow, and the growing tension, the soldiers began to doubt the very logic of the campaign. Because even when everything went well, coordinated attack, position gained, supplies captured, the engine could still fail, and an engine that fails kills more than an ambush. Corporal Franz Müller, a Tiger operator, described the experience as driving a magnificent beast that can die at any moment for an invisible detail. This was the German reality. It was no longer a war of armor, range, or caliber. It was a war of compatible fuels, and she was already lost. Because the enemy, contrary to what the propaganda pamphlet said, was not disorganized. It was a cog that fed on itself, and the next revelation would come from above, literally, because the American Air Force, until then absent from direct combat in the Ardennes because of bad weather, was about to retake the skies, and with it would come not only the bombing, but the reaffirmation that, in industrial war, those who fly with predictability dominate with permanence. In the heart of the Ardennes, the road has become an epitaph. The tracks left by the German armored vehicles did not end in conquest. They ended in silence. A metallic, heavy silence that spread out into miles of abandoned tanks. Panzer V's, Panthers, and even the dreaded Tigers were there, perfectly operational in appearance, with the tracks intact, cannons loaded, radios working, but immobile. Not because of tactical failure, not because of enemy bombing, but because of an almost invisible detail, the absence of fuel. In some units, crewmen were ordered to evacuate vehicles, install demolition charges, and destroy their own symbols of strength before they fell into Allied hands. In others, the remaining fuel was used only to set fire to the inside of the tanks. What the Germans could no longer use, they would not let anyone use either. A logistical suicide in slow motion. The cruel irony was that while German tanks burned, American columns advanced, and not marching, driving. Next to each destroyed Tiger passed a convoy of GMC trucks. Sherman warmed up with engines running to keep crews protected from the cold, radios communicating positions, commands being updated in real time. It was the absolute contrast. One army was crumbling on the ice, the other was going through the war warmed by abundance. On several routes, Waffen-SS soldiers walked on foot in disorganized groups without a motorized escort. They carried backpacks, rifles, and a weight in their eyes that not even winter could freeze. They were soldiers of an army that had bet everything on an offensive that depended on the imponderable, and that, in the face of reality, imploded from within. A group of the 1st SS Panzer Leibstandarte traveled nearly 20 kilometers on foot, in silence, crossing intersections where newly arrived Shermans were still in factory paint, and inside them, soldiers eating heated food, listening to the radio, smiling, a contrast impossible to ignore. The battlefield had ceased to be a space for confrontation. It had become a living showcase of the difference between improvisation and structure, between urgency and redundancy, and between despair and control. At one of the most symbolic passes of the offensive near La Glaise, Pieper was forced to abandon about 135 vehicles, including 22 tanks. He destroyed them one by one, He left behind what was most modern and imposing in the arsenal of the Waffen-SS. The Tiger II, a symbol of German engineering, was abandoned as technical scrap. It was operational collapse in its purest form. Tanks that could take on 10 enemies and win, but couldn't start. And at that moment, a suffocating statistic came to life. In December 1944, the United States produced 370,000 barrels of gasoline per day. Germany, with all its synthetic fuel plants and crumbling fields, barely reached 35,000, a difference of more than 10 times. If this comparison impresses you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because that is what was confirmed there. The war was not won at the cannon, it was won at the supply pump. And in the absence of this bomb, the strategy turned into retreat. A German general would confess years later that, in the Ardennes, we did not lose by the guns, but by the chronometer. Time was against them. The fuel ran out before the mission. The gear replaced the engine. And every kilometer advanced was a risk. Trust has disappeared, replaced by caution and silence. A silence so deep that it made the snow an agent of testimony. And the snow piled up around the destroyed tanks, slowly covering them, as if nature itself wanted to bury not the vehicles, but the idea that the war could be won by courage alone. What remained was the realization. The road had become a cemetery, but not soldiers. It was the graveyard of German logistics, a place where engineering has found its own limits, where doctrine has collapsed under the weight of statistics, and where fuel, or lack thereof, has determined the fate of a nation. And what lay ahead was not salvation. It was the closing of the siege. Because, with the retaking of the skies by the Allied Air Force, what was left of German mobility would be pulverized in the open field. The next phase would no longer involve stationary tanks. It would involve planes hunting down everything that still moved. For many Wehrmacht soldiers, surrender did not happen the moment they laid down their arms, but days or weeks earlier, when they witnessed, with their own eyes, what the censored reports never mentioned: American abundance. Captured in small groups, wounded or simply isolated after the collapse of the Ardennes offensive, these men arrived at the prison camps bringing more than abandoned weapons. They brought a new understanding of war. A soldier from the 326th Volksgrenadier Division reported in interrogation that when he was taken to the American rearguard, he saw soldiers using gasoline to wash grease-stained pieces of uniform. Another prisoner described with astonishment the existence of trucks dedicated only to transporting food for military dogs. The dogs, well-fed, healthy, cared for with care, ate better than their families in Dresden, and this seemingly insignificant detail was a moral blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was irrefutable. No advertisement could erase that. No speech by Goebbels could turn that into weakness of the enemy. On the contrary, it was the very symbol of German defeat. While Germany counted crumbs, the United States counted in tons, and they didn't hide it. On the contrary, they exuded this excess as a strategic truth. The letters that the soldiers tried to send home, and which were often censored, let out revealing passages. "They live in another world," wrote one Bavarian corporal. "We can't win, not because they fight better, but because they don't have to stop." There was a new kind of silence among the prisoners. It wasn't fear. That was the finding. The enemy was not only numerically superior, he was logistically infinite. And in the face of infinity, strategy becomes formality. One of the most experienced American interrogators in the field, Lieutenant James Felder, reported that the hardest German soldiers, members of the SS, veteran officers of the Eastern Front, showed no anger when captured. They showed fatigue, and in some cases relief, because now they knew what they faced was no longer a military force. It was an entire civilization designed for total war. In another episode near Malmedy, a prisoner reported seeing a campfire being fed with damaged ammunition boxes. They were not being reused. They were being discarded. For the Germans, every cartridge counted. To Americans, an unused box was just a statistic. This kind of contrast eroded morale more strongly than any artillery. The Reich soldiers, trained to resist to the end, began to question where that end was, and worse, if it really mattered. Because the end, it seemed, had already been decided by spreadsheets and refineries thousands of miles from the front. A panzer can face another panzer, but no soldier can face the idea that the enemy has everything, always. The perception of the war was distorted. It was no longer about bravery, discipline, or command. It was about permanence. And permanence, at that moment of the war, only existed on one side. An American general once said that logistics is what turns courage into results. And to the captured German soldiers, that phrase would have sounded like an epitaph, not for their bodies, but for the illusion that there was still a chance. They had not been defeated for lack of courage. They had been overwhelmed by scale, by endless columns of supplies, for barrels that kept coming, for spare parts that appeared even before the failure, by overeating, for fuel to spare, and for a certainty that grew like fog. To fight was to resist, but to resist no longer changed destiny. The adversary was not only powerful, it was inevitable, and if there was anything crueler than losing a war, it was to understand that there was never any way to win it. This perception spread through the prison camps, through intercepted letters, through memories written years later, and in a symbolic gesture, some Wehrmacht officers, as they handed over their pistols to the Americans, muttered in low tones, "We have done our best." But the truth was more brutal. What was possible for Germany was insufficient from the first day of that offensive. The impossible was that he guided the Americans, and they were about to make it even clearer, not with words, but with figures. Because the next piece of data to be revealed would show in cold numbers how the American effort managed to resupply 3 entire armies while destroying a hungry enemy. In the underground bunker of Army Group B in Heistern, Field Marshal Walter Model leafed through the reports with his fingers stiff and his eyes fixed. By the end of December 1944, it was no longer a question of maneuvers or front lines, but of commas, numerical columns, and consumption tables. The document he read for the second time in absolute silence recorded that the United States had deliberately burned more than 8 million gallons of gasoline to prevent use by German troops. Model, known for his operational coolness, muttered something inaudible, put the paper down on the table and lit a cigarette, slowly. It was a banal gesture, but loaded with meaning. The general who had led the most brutal fighting on the Eastern Front now found himself powerless in the face of a logistical equation. In another room, supply intelligence officers presented estimates of Allied consumption. The average American supply that week had exceeded 1.8 million gallons per day on the Western Front alone. This meant that every 24 hours the Allies poured into the battlefield, almost the equivalent of the entire monthly capacity of Germany's synthetic refineries. General von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Division, listened to the projection in silence, and then made a dry note. "We are no longer fighting the same war." The phrase echoed through the walls of the bunker as an admission of defeat that could not yet be uttered in public. Albert Speer, Minister of Industry and Armaments, had already warned Hitler weeks before the offensive began. The Reich was entering an offensive operation with energy reserves compatible with less than 15 days of intense fighting. Speer proposed the cancellation of the operation. He said that the advance would only be sustainable with the immediate capture of fuel, and even then, more logistical resources would be burned trying to transport what was captured than maintaining defensive positions. Hitler ignored it. But now, with the American reports in hand, the spreadsheets were no longer theory. They were sentences. Operation Wacht am Rhein, conceived as a turning of the board, turned out to be a mathematical suicide. At one of the crisis meetings, a quartermaster major candidly declared, "America can make mistakes and keep going. We need to get everything right. And even then it may not be enough." The German war logic, based on precision and discipline, collapsed in the face of American logic, redundancy, volume, and permanence. At operational levels, the collapse was clear. Field officers reported delays of days in the delivery of fuel promised by the high command. The supporting artillery remained silent for lack of ammunition, while the radios broadcast messages that still insisted on maintaining the offensive spirit. This disconnect between discourse and reality became unbearable. The rhetoric of German moral and technical superiority, hammered away for years, could not resist the sound of Allied engines running without interruption. The commander of the 6th Panzer Division reported that during the 3rd week of the offensive, his convoy was ordered to retreat 15 kilometers to fetch fuel, under aerial bombardment. Progress was impossible. The withdrawal was unfeasible. The stoppage, inevitable. And what sealed this immobility were not cannons, mines, or ambushes. They were barrels. There was a lack of barrels. There were plenty of orders. At OKW meetings, officials who once spoke of strategic initiative now used phrases like flow inconsistency and logistical priority breakdown. The language had changed because the enemy had changed. The enemy was now no longer just the United States Army. It was his system, a system that predicted losses, calculated routes, absorbed failures, and kept going. Consumption data began to circulate like weapons. An Allied supply chart caused more panic than an armored advance, because there was no longer any defense against that. It was a continuous, impersonal, unshakable flow. One of Model's aides described the moment as a castle surrounded not by troops but by shipping containers. There was no possible hero in the face of this. There was only the conclusion. War had ceased to be a battlefield and had become a supply system. And in this new scenario, the Reich was a cornered animal, breathing for the last time before the collapse. The most feared sound was no longer that of gunshots. It was the sound of American engines running, non-stop. The German machinery stagnated. The American gear, even under attack, even under mistakes, never stopped turning. And while Hitler asked for more faith, his generals were already making containment calculations. They knew that the end would not come with an explosion, but with a dry cut in resources. And he was getting closer and closer, because in addition to the ground, the sky also began to belong to the enemy. And the next move would come from above, fast, precise, and devastating. When the weather opened up over the Ardennes on December 23, 1944, the battlefield shifted its axis. What until then had been a war of armored vehicles and infantry mired in frozen mud suddenly turned into an air theater dominated by engines that did not stop. Within hours, the once gray skies were filled with roars from hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, flying low, in formation, with lethal precision. It was not a show. It was a meticulously scheduled and logistically sustained aerial massacre. On that single day, the Allied Air Force launched more than 2,000 sorties on German positions. Every minute, there were planes taking off, bombing, returning, refueling, and taking off again. The decisive factor was not tactical. It was volumetric. A single P-47 consumed an average of 300 gallons of fuel per hour in combat flight. A full squadron of 16 fighters needed nearly 5,000 gallons for a standard mission. And even then, there was plenty of fuel. Refineries in England operated at a continuous pace. Tankers crossed the English Channel protected by convoys and dumped barrels into ports connected directly to the continental pipeline network. The operation was so integrated that it only took an order for hundreds of aircraft to be fueled, armed and launched into the air in less than 2 hours. It wasn't Air Force. It was a strategic delivery system. Meanwhile, on the German side, the Luftwaffe was on the ground. Literally. Jet fuel, especially high-octane kerosene, had become a rarity since the summer of 1944. The synthetic production plants at Leuna and Politz, which accounted for much of the supply, were in ruins after months of Allied bombing. The remaining stocks were directed to priority units, mainly anti-aircraft defense units. This meant that even if there were pilots and fighters, the tanks were dry. Germany still had hundreds of aircraft, FW-190s, Me-109s, even the new jet Me-262s. But the vast majority were pinned to the ground, covered with tarpaulins, hidden in forests, waiting for fuel that would never come. In an internal report dated December 25th, the Luftwaffe command admitted that less than 15% of the aircraft available on the Western Front were in operational condition, and this included basic maintenance, ammunition, and fuel. Meanwhile, the U.S. 9th Air Command operated at 90% availability, a difference not in capacity, but in supply, and the difference was directly reflected on the surface. Entire German columns were destroyed by air raids on narrow roads, vehicles without cover, abandoned armored vehicles, troops on the march, all visible from the sky and vulnerable to the precision of American machine guns and bombs. The sky, which had once been the domain of engineering and the heroism of pilots, now belonged to logistics. Each Allied sortie was sustained by a production chain that began in the Gulf of Mexico, crossed the Atlantic, and ended at refueling pumps in France. And this supply did not stop, not even at night. For many German soldiers, the sight of American fighters plunging freely over the front lines became synonymous with the end. Because no matter the bravery of the infantry, no matter the accuracy of the marksmen, nothing could stop an enemy who saw everything from above and acted with unlimited fuel. And if there was a greater irony in all this, it was this. The Luftwaffe had not been defeated in combat. She had been suffocated in silence. There was no confrontation in the air. There was absence. A void where there was strength before. American air superiority was not a matter of piloting or bravery. It was a matter of logistics, a cold, calculated logic supplied by pipelines and reserves. War was no longer decided by who flew better, but by who could always fly, and the Americans succeeded. With every German tank destroyed by aerial bombs, with every convoy interrupted by bursts from the sky, a new piece of data was printed on the Allied spreadsheets. Air dominance was not just tactical, it was structural, and it was this dominance that would allow the Americans to do what the Germans could no longer even plan: counterattack with full force. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. Because what comes next is not just the return of Allied artillery, it's the final collapse of the German offensive machine. The fuel is gone, the air has been taken, and the ground is about to change hands. In the early morning of December 17, 1944, the vanguard of the German offensive crossed the village of Ardennes, near Malmedy. Ahead, as always, was advancing the Kampfgruppe Piper, the elite armored unit of the Waffen-SS, led by Colonel Joachim Piper. On the narrow road, columns of German vehicles snaked slowly, conscious of every liter consumed. Fuel was already scarce on the second day of the operation, and with each kilometer conquered, mathematics became more brutal than artillery. When they encountered a retreating American force consisting of units of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Division, they surrendered immediately. American soldiers were outnumbered, unprepared, and isolated. They were disarmed and escorted to an open field by the side of the road. There, instead of being prosecuted as prisoners of war, they were machine-gunned. The Malmedy massacre, as it would go down in history, killed 84 American soldiers, many with their hands raised. The reason: colder than any winter in the Ardennes. The SS vehicles did not have enough fuel to transport prisoners. Post-war testimony from officers subordinate to Piper confirms this. There were implicit orders to eliminate the captured when logistical advance was compromised. In other words, fuel shortages have become a death sentence. The missing jerry cans in the trucks turned into bullets in the field. The code of conduct was rewritten by the logistics spreadsheet. The moral degradation of the troops followed the rhythm of structural failure. It wasn't just about ideological brutality. It was the economics of collapse seeping into tactical decisions. When the fuel runs out, time shortens, empathy evaporates, and efficiency becomes a cruel instinct. For Piper's troops, there was no way to care for prisoners, feed them, protect them, or transport them. There was only one obsession: moving forward. Every minute stopped, every liter spent outside the primary mission, was a risk of definitive stagnation. And in this operational logic, deformed by scarcity, the surrendered enemy was a logistical obstacle. The decision to kill was no longer just ideological, it also became operational. The brutality of the Waffen-SS was not born on those roads, but there, in the Ardennes, it was turbocharged by the lack of fuel. What was once an army now behaved like a desperate predator, tearing up rules, ignoring conventions, guided only by the urgency not to stop. The massacre was not the only one. In Trois Ponts, in Stavelot, in L'Église, other similar reports would emerge. Prisoners executed, terrified civilians, officers ignoring the laws of war, and always, between the lines, the same justification: there was no way to take them. Logistics, that cold science of gallons, tires, and schedules, had become an ethical compass, and when she disappeared, she dragged with her what was left of the discipline. One of the post-war interrogations of an SS sergeant captured in January 1945 sums up this decline with a dry sentence: "We had no trucks. We only had ammunition." It is hard to imagine a clearer sentence on the point at which the German army had come. The fuel crisis was no longer just a matter of mobility. It became a moral lens. An immobilized army is not just a vulnerable army. It is a pressured, dehydrated, and emotionally exhausted army. And in the case of the SS, this became a license for horror. The responsibility, of course, remains, but the context reveals how technique and morality are intertwined. The ability to keep prisoners alive, to respect the rules of war, depends on resources: trucks that work, of extra food, of available guards. When all this disappears, what is left is impulse, hatred, and despair. And perhaps the bitterest irony is precisely there, the logistical superiority of the United States, which supplied even German prisoners with combat rations, contrasted with Germany's own inability to do the same for surrendered soldiers. The enemy was able to keep even his captives alive, Germany, nor its own men. The cog was grinding everything, including codes of conduct. And while Piper retreated to L'Église, pursued and isolated, the bodies of the American soldiers remained frozen in the camp. Local witnesses would later say that their faces seemed to look up at the sky, a sky that, on that day, no longer belonged to them, and not to Germany. Because while the SS tanks burned their last leaders, a new front was approaching, the American offensive. And it didn't just come with tanks. It came with trucks, with fuel, with mobile hospitals, reverse-engineered. It came with everything that Germany no longer had, because while one side killed for lack of gasoline, the other won with excess supply. And the final bill for this difference was yet to come. As the Ardennes soil turned into a graveyard of immovable tanks, the heated rooms of the Führer bunker remained steeped in a carefully scripted theater. Hitler, sitting in front of maps that no longer corresponded to reality, kept issuing orders as if Operation Wacht am Rhein was only overdue, not collapsed. As Speer, the armaments minister, presented reports on the physical impossibility of sustaining the offensive, Hitler responded with disbelief, disdain, and sometimes delirium. When the general showed aerial images of American depots set on fire at Stavelot, not by German artillery but by the Allies themselves, to prevent use by the invaders, the response was sarcastic. Yankee propaganda, Hollywood. What for the technicians was proof of the enemy's logistical reach, the ability to give up millions of gallons. For Hitler was a show. Reality, with its data, consumption maps, and collapse statistics, knocked on the door. But the ideological discourse kept it locked. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, tried more than once to warn the Führer. He pointed out that fuel reserves would not even allow for an organized withdrawal, that each additional day at the front meant more tanks left behind, more soldiers marching on foot, more casualties without replacement. The response was a rhetorical appeal. Only absolute faith can turn the tide of events. But faith does not move engines, nor does it heat armored vehicles, nor does it fuel planes. In silence, senior officers began to record what they called the double front, the war in the West and the war within the command. On one side, the men trying to save what was left of the operational force. On the other, a dome clinging to the mythology of German invincibility. Guderian, the chief of staff, even wrote in his diary that the numbers scream, but the walls of this bunker are deaf. The offensive was dead, but the propaganda was still alive and voracious. German radio broadcast tactical victories, reports of courage, destruction of enemy columns, advance of Panzergruppen that had already retreated or been annihilated. The public in the bombed cities received newspapers announcing the decisive turn. Posters extolled the achievements of the Waffen-SS. The printed paper of the victory circulated faster than the supply trucks. It was a war of versions. And in the official version, Germany still had a chance. The dissonance between narrative and field was so deep that isolated units in the Ardennes reported confusion among soldiers. Some believed they were winning. Others understood that they were just delaying the inevitable. There were tanks without fuel with motivational posters pasted on the sides. Pilots without kerosene received moral speeches. Officers read victory bulletins as they buried comrades. It was the final collision between rhetoric and reality. The institutionalized lie was not just a political instrument. It had become a cog in the war, a way to keep the army moving without fuel, substituting gasoline for faith. But even faith needs a road. And in the Ardennes, they were blocked, frozen, occupied by Allied columns on the counter-offensive. Sherman tanks advanced in formation, escorted by supplies, air support, and intelligence. Every American step was predictable, because every resource had been calculated. There was no improvisation, there was planning, and that was the real difference. Germany did not lose only for what was missing. We also lost for what we refused to see. And if there is an image that sums up this phase of the conflict, it is that of a German MG-42 machine gun, impeccable, functional, positioned on top of a hill, but abandoned. Next to it, a pamphlet from the Ministry of Propaganda still attached with tape to the barrel. Victory requires sacrifice. Sacrifice the impossible. This phrase, more than a slogan, was an epitaph, because the impossible had already been sacrificed, and what was left was only the countdown. At Allied headquarters, the maps changed every night, but on the German side, the orders always came from the same source, and with the same mistake: ignoring the numbers, ignore reality, deny the truth that the empty jerry can screamed every day. And it is precisely then that the logistical collapse turns into institutional collapse, because a war can be lost on the field, but it is in command that it becomes irreversible, and the moment of irreversibility was about to arrive, not with an explosion, but with a silent retreat. The sound of Allied engines booming on the roads, while German radios still proclaimed victory. The contrast between what was heard and what was experienced was so great that a Wehrmacht officer would write years later that lies weighed more than ammunition in pockets. But there is a limit even for fiction, and he would come with a movement that Hitler never foresaw, the American turn. Because on the other side of the forest, a supplied, motivated, and furious army was already preparing the answer, and it would come not with propaganda, but with oil and steel. The Tiger II-113, a model that symbolizes German armored arrogance, rests to this day in Le Glaise. In the winter of 1944, this steel colossus, with its 88mm turret and almost impenetrable armor, was left behind, intact, armed, feared, but immobile, not because of an Allied shell, not by sabotage, only for lack of fuel. And this detail sums up a profound transformation. The Battle of the Bulge was not only the last major German offensive on the Western Front, it was the definitive breaking point between two eras of the war. On the one hand, the old conception of combat based on bravery, on strokes of tactical genius, on elite units driven by will and discipline. On the other, the new reality: continental logistics chains, mass production, supply intelligence, and operational redundancy. For the first time in modern history, victory no longer depended on courage in the field, but was decided in refineries, docks, and distribution centers. The image of the motionless tiger, surrounded by soldiers marching on foot, contrasts brutally with the American columns fueled by mobile ducks and night refueling, an army that fought with gallons, not with heroic gestures. While German officers handed out decorations to boost morale, the Americans handed out rations and fuel, ensuring that each platoon moved forward with a full supply. The hero was no longer the infantry commander. He was the logistics engineer, the pipeline operator, the driver of the Red Ball Express that crisscrossed France at top speed, night after night. The war had become technical, industrial, mathematical, and in this, Germany, with all its martial tradition, was doomed, because even his most impressive tactical feats, such as Piper's initial advance or successful ambushes in the woods, could not be sustained without supplies. The Tiger was a beast that required 800 liters a day, the Panther almost as much, and the tow trucks, the generators, the radios, all thirsty for a fuel that the Reich could no longer produce, let alone transport. Meanwhile, the Americans were burning hundreds of thousands of gallons a day just to keep fighters flying over areas where there might be enemy movement. That was the new equation: gallons per kilometer. And in this math, courage is no longer a factor of victory. The German soldier could resist, improvise, fight to the last bullet, but the U.S. military was moving forward with spreadsheets, logistical maps, automated supply, and plenty of inventory. Individual glory, extolled by Nazi propaganda, sank into the snow alongside inert engines. The romanticism of war died there. He died at the makeshift gas station that never arrived. He died in the escort that did not appear. He died at the command post that sent orders to tanks that were already abandoned. He died in the idea that the war could be won with speeches. The reality was simpler and more brutal. The U.S. military moved 11,000 tons a day. Each unit received not only ammunition, but medical replacement, spare parts, groceries, fuel, and all this with predictability. War had become a system, and the system worked. On the German side, what was left was an operational patchwork: captured vehicles, incompatible fuels, improvised logistics, collapsed chains of command. The pamphlets of encouragement that extolled honor and sacrifice could no longer push the armored vehicles up the hill, because it wasn't a lack of courage, it was a lack of gallons. And in this realization lay the final humiliation. A commander could lose a fight and be forgiven, But losing due to lack of planning, due to the inability to supply his troops, was a defeat without glory. The Battle of the Bulge ended not just a campaign, it ended a mindset, and with it the last illusion that bravery could overcome production. The tiger in L'Église remains where it left off. It was not removed, it was not destroyed, it was not restored. It was left there, as a symbol of the end, an involuntary statue of technical impotence in the face of industrial excess, a tank that hasn't been vanquished, just overtaken by a much larger gear. Because in the end, World War II was not decided in the trenches, it was decided in the pipelines. And the next part of that story will reveal how this cog, made of oil, steel, and spreadsheets, didn't just beat Germany, but it redefined the very concept of war. Hansfeld, December 1944. Colonel Joachim Peiper looks at the 50,000 gallons of American gasoline as if he were finding a well in the desert. A logistical miracle, abandoned in a hurry, with coffee still hot and bonfires lit. For a few hours, he believed that this was a sign. But as he leafed through the papers left behind, spreadsheets, distribution maps, daily supply numbers, he understood the mistake. Those jerry cans, which he considered decisive, were a negligible fraction, a rounding error in the Allied daily consumption. While Germany celebrated the find as a victory, the United States treated it as a margin of waste. The war was already lost before the first shot, not because the German soldiers fought badly, but because they were inside a doomed system, collapsed from within and powerless in the face of the enemy's logistical volume. Operation Bulge, sold as a stroke of genius, proved to be the strategic epitaph of a regime that underestimated the mathematics of industry. While Germany burned heroes, the United States burned fuel and won. The real war was not between armored divisions, but between productive systems, and only one of them could make a mistake and continue winning. The lesson is clear and brutal. It is not enough to have bravery. It is necessary to sustain it. Logistics is not support. It is the backbone. Strategy is born from what you can move, maintain, and restock. And when Peiper realized that his tanks depended on the enemy's fuel, the collapse ceased to be military. It became moral. As Albert Speer admitted after the war with bitterness and lucidity, we were not defeated by the Allied armies. We were defeated by trucks, pipelines, and engines that never stopped. If you value real stories, grounded in data and free from easy rhetoric, leave your like and subscribe to strengthen the research and the search for historical truth. Write in the comments what was the most shocking fact you discovered in this video, the one that made you rethink what defines a war. And ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact that the world tried to forget. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.